The air in the executive boardroom was filtered and cold, but it felt suffocating. The chief financial officer was not looking at the slides on the screen. He was looking at the silent faces around the mahogany table. He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, which made the words cut deeper. He stated that the company had just authorized a $2 million expansion into the premium tier, based on a Project Ed lifetime value report that was now appearing to be a complete fabrication. He wanted to know which department had verified the data. He wanted to know how a decision of this magnitude had been made on a foundation of sand. Chris Jordan sat in the third chair from the door, hands folded beneath the table to hide the fact that they were trembling. Chris was not a department head or a vice president, but as the senior data analyst, the report in question was Chris's creation. The room remained silent for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. The chief executive officer looked toward Chris and asked if the logic behind the lifetime value calculation had been audited for the seasonal churn variables they had discussed in March. Chris opened his mouth to answer, but the words felt like they were caught in a dry throat. In that moment, the professional reputation Chris had spent 7 years building was beginning to dissolve in the light of the projector. Part 1. The problem. Chris Jordan was the senior data analyst at a B2B software company with over 5,000 customers. On paper, Chris was the gatekeeper of truth for the entire organization. But the reality of a full reporting week was a grueling marathon of manual labor that left no room for actual analysis. A typical Monday began at 7 o'clock with the extraction of raw data from 5 different sources: Salesforce, Stripe, Zendesk, and 2 internal databases that did not talk to each other. 10 hours, just cleaning rows and columns. By Friday evening, Chris was still hunched over a laptop, finalizing financial reporting for the weekend review. The cost of this burden was strategic blindness. On a Tuesday afternoon in February, the vice president of sales stopped by to ask why the churn rate for the premium tier seemed to be accelerating in the Northeast region. Chris had to explain that an investigation would take at least a full week of manual data pulling. The vice president nodded and walked away. Chris was supposed to be the navigator, but was too busy shoveling coal in the engine room to look at the horizon. Chris spent every Tuesday and Wednesday producing the weekly recurring revenue report. It was a document that everyone looked at for 5 minutes. It required 30 hours of manual labor to produce. The report was a tradition that had become a prison. Part 2. The disaster. Chris decided to build an automation pipeline over a single frantic weekend in April, connecting the disparate databases into a centralized script that could clean the data in seconds. At 2 o'clock that Saturday, the first complex SQL query ran automatically. Chris watched as the screen populated with thousands of rows of perfectly formatted data without a single manual keystroke. It felt like a miracle. By Sunday afternoon, the full dashboard was working. For the first time in nearly a year, Chris went to bed before midnight. On Monday morning, the AI Generate Ed insight about the premium tier lifetime value, Land Ed, in the executive dashboard. It looked incredibly credible. Historical renewal patterns and secondary market trends that Chris usually never had time to include. The dashboard looked so clean. The numbers were so optimistic. Chris dismissed a single nagging question about why the support costs looked unusually low. The visual perfection of the data acted as a sedative for professional skepticism. The executive meeting where the $2 million decision was made happened on a Tuesday. The chief financial officer asked Chris if the model accounted for the increased support burden of high-touch customers. Chris felt a sudden sharp hesitation, a quiet voice suggesting that the AI might have smoothed over the outliers. But the momentum in the room was too strong. Chris did not speak up. Chris nodded and said the data was robust. The expansion was authorized. $2 million committed to a marketing and support blitz launching 48 hours later. Part 3. The damage. The emergency meeting 3 weeks later was the result of that silence. After the CFO finished speaking and the room cleared, Chris went back to the desk and stayed there. The investigation that night revealed what would later be called the tenure gap. The AI had hallucinated the high lifetime value because it had failed to recognize that the most successful premium customers were also receiving unofficial, unlogged discounts from the sales team. It had confused a high price tag with high profitability. Chris sat alone in the dim light of the office at 3 o'clock in the morning, looking at the churn rate data the automation had ignored. The support burden for the new tier was actually 3 times higher than the revenue it generated. The full picture had been sitting in the raw data the entire time, buried beneath the beautiful dashboard. Chris had traded accuracy for speed, and the cost was a $2 million hole in the company's budget. Part 4. The rebuild. The recovery began with a total rejection of blind automation. Chris built a verification system that placed the analyst back at the center of the process. The AI flagged that 80% of the customer base was using the new collaboration tool. In the old workflow, Chris would have reported that as a major success. But in the new system, Chris paused and audited the source code. The feature was auto-enabled on login. The usage was passive, not intentional. When Chris presented this corrected finding to the product team, the room went silent. The vice president of product realized they had been on the verge of sunsetting a legacy tool. He asked how the mistake was caught. Chris explained the necessity of auditing the machine's assumptions before presenting any finding to leadership. That moment changed Chris's standing in the organization. He was no longer just a reporter of data. He was a gatekeeper of decisions. Part 5. The second failure. But that credibility created a new problem Chris had not anticipated. Because the automation had made Chris look like a superhero, the organization now expected that same speed for every request. Slack messages arriving one after another. The VP of sales wanted a report by noon. The marketing director wanted a segment analysis by 2. Chris was working until midnight for the 3rd consecutive time that week. That evening, Chris sat on the sofa at home while a partner spoke about plans for the weekend. Chris was physically present, mentally stuck in a SQL table, barely hearing the conversation. The partner stopped talking and asked if Chris was actually there. They said it felt like Chris had become an extension of the office server, always on, always processing, and never truly home. Chris realized that the efficiency of the tools had not reduced the workload. It had simply increased the appetite of the company. The following Monday, Chris walked into a capacity framework meeting with a document outlining exactly how many deep dive analyses could be completed in a 40-hour week under the new verification standards. Chris explained that the organization could have speed, or it could have the truth, but it could no longer have both at the same price. The manager looked at the $2 million lesson and agreed. A formal intake process was implemented that prioritized strategic impact over tactical speed. Part 6. The resolution. 6 months later, Chris was no longer the person who provided the most data. Chris was the person who provided the most clarity. On a Friday afternoon in November, an email arrived from the CFO, an invitation to discuss a promotion to Director of Strategic Insights. He wrote that the company did not need faster dashboards. They needed an analyst who knew when to tell the dashboard it was wrong. One Monday in the new role, the AI flagged a sudden spike in trial-to-paid conversions in the Asian market. Chris dug deeper. It was a sophisticated bot attack designed to inflate stock sentiment. Catching that attack before it reached the board felt even better than the promotion itself. It was proof that the value was not in the hands. It was in the hesitation. When you automate the process of thinking, you inadvertently automate the process of making mistakes. The true advantage of technology is not the ability to generate answers. It is the freedom it gives you to ask better questions. Do not let the pursuit of speed become the enemy of your integrity. Build the verification first. Use the tools to support your judgment, not to replace it. At the AI Advantage, we examine the case studies that show you where the line is before you cross it. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday.
Subscribe and follow along.